episode of Agilifying Agile Coaches, where we explore a variety of ways, methods, processes and thoughts on Agile coaching to help us improve our own world of work and sharpen our own proverbial sword. What people often get wrong is the difference between different and wrong. I was at a rather fine conference recently. The event was good, the people great. Alas, not everything can be perfect. I went to one workshop where the presenter started walking us through their approach. They talked about how they liked a continuous integration model rather than, as with Scrum does, branching. They also discussed how they preferred Kanban to Scrum, as they like to launch more frequently when Scrum only lets you launch every 2 to 4 weeks. Now, as you probably know, these things were wrong. Factual errors, mistakes made by the speaker. Scrum doesn't even comment on engineering practices, though many good Scrum teams use extreme programming. And Scrum does not stop you launching as frequently as you like. I myself, as a very ex-developer, like to work in a continuously integrated main branch approach with frequent or daily releases. We actually did this on our very first Scrum product delivery back in 2003-2004. However, some people confuse different with wrong. If we revisit Cynefin, it talks about complicated work normally involving good practices. Just remember, good does not equal best. Just because something works in your context, in other contexts, maybe many other contexts, it does not mean it works in all contexts. This is why the very idea of a best practice suitable in all contexts is an idea or concept best left in the simple domain of work. In complex work, we should be looking for emergent practices that evolve as we learn and gain feedback. This could sound like an excuse to avoid something like Scrum, but I would suggest that is an error. The philosophy of Scrum is of a meta framework to allow you to inspect and adapt your products and your processes to improve your products and processes. I've heard it referred to as being a bit like a software debugger if you're a software engineer, or an MRI scanner, or even your mother-in-law, sorry. So Scrum is really the mechanism to discover which practices and approaches are most appropriate and is not the practices under review themselves. But either way, there are a range of practices that we could adopt and or evolve. As an example, I was once hired to produce a 90-minute session on something agile for a large insurance company. I chose to do the session on agile project initiation approaches. I ended up spending about a month developing the presentation, and it did not seem like a good return on investment at the time. But do you know what? It has been the gift that keeps giving. Actually, if I remember correctly, I interviewed about 7 or 8 companies and did a site visit for about half of them. I wanted to find out what they actually do to get product development going and how agile they feel they are. The results, in one way, were not surprising. The more agile they felt, the shorter and higher level the initiation processes were. The one exception was one company that felt chaotic and had almost no processes at all. The other way was more interesting. Each had effectively grown their own approach. Each had inspected and adapted their approaches. Each had adopted and co-opted other good practices, Kanban, Lean Startup, etc., into their own models. So they, and this is even the very limited, barely agile organisations, were being agile with their approaches. Or were they? You see, some had adopted other practices into their approaches. One company based theirs around the classic Prince 2 approach. Now, whether you're fond of Prince 2 or not, and it has slowly evolved over the decades since I first met it, it does still encourage a very traditional approach in many organisations. So, could that be wrong? Wrapping core practice with good practice with potentially bad practice? Or is that a recipe for success? Or disaster? Enter stage left, Scrum. A lot of Scrum is not Scrum. I have heard a fair bit of bad-mouthing of Scrum across industry. Like Google or Hoover or Ford, it is often people's mental model when someone says Agile. And like Ford or Hoover on Google, being popular and famous has its disadvantages. There are many half-baked Agile implementations, and most of them are based around the most popular approach, Scrum. I remember at one conference a speaker standing up and declaring they are stepping away from Scrum. They are stopping using velocity. Cue shocked audience. And I just thought, great, velocity isn't part of Scrum, it's just a practice a lot of us use. It gets abused in many companies, so good for you for finding another way. But it was then I realised that a lot of people in that room felt it was part of Scrum. Confusing a good practice with an essential one is a mistake. They are different. You could be throwing the baby out with the bathwater if you're not careful. Enter stage right, pursued by Agile Bear, the Nigel Scale. I first published the Nigel Scale on the private Certified Scrum Trainer and Coach forum around August 2009. I first published it publicly around 2011. It is now in use by at least one Agile coach on earth. Me. Simply put, the Nigel Scale was a model originally created to differentiate between what is Scrum and what wasn't. This was back before documents like the Scrum Guide existed. This is a time when Scrum was still quite malleable. This Nigel Scale was used in discussion amongst us trainers to help us differentiate between what should and what shouldn't be taught in a certified Scrum Master workshop. The model works as follows. Nigel Scale 1, NS1. This is Scrum as now recognised by the Scrum Guide. Before that it was Appendix C in Enterprise and Scrum. This is the core essentials, the fundamentals. Nigel Scale 2. This is stuff Scrum doesn't officially care about. The grey area of good practices. This is where we use our prior experience to help coach organisations to self-organise their own answers to their own complex problems. And then there is Nigel Scale 3, NS3. This is anti-agile, bad practices, anti-patterns or negative behaviours we try and stay away from. They have a detrimental effect on value delivery, productivity, general happiness and morale. And in short, these are all risk inflation strategies. Now, hopefully, you can already see that this scale can be useful in many situations and not just as an esoteric mind game for trainers. There is a huge difference between core practices, good practices, and bad practices. As a coach, this is where we can choose appropriate stances and appropriate discipline. We can start to see where we should offer variability or flexibility, where we should be strict and have great discipline, and where we need to cut. That's easier said than done, however. So if I asked you to identify the various elements of the Nigel Scale in this phrase, could you? The tester put the user story ticket into Jira so it will be visualised on the task board and so the product owner can calculate velocity correctly. Answers in the comments, please. In my opinion, the general direction of Scrum over the last 15 years has been a gradual thinning out. There has been more and more movement of what was Scrum into the big box of good practice. So the Nigel Scale can help you better understand the fundamentals of Scrum and better understand the good practices that many add to their frameworks. But that isn't the end. Now you can take my model and apply it to things like Kanban. I am of the opinion there is a heck of a lot of Kanban in industry today that isn't actually Kanban. I remember extreme programming suffering because inexperienced people thought it was an all or nothing approach and thus chose nothing. Sad. So, how as a coach can I apply this in the real world? We could use this model to first identify anti-patterns and then prioritise those defects and remove them. Again, a whole new topic to discuss. There are a range of impediment removal models available to us as coaches. Though I probably wouldn't want to do that removal myself. I would want to be actually assisting and collaborating, working side by side with teams and management, and I'm sure by doing so we could help them find some appropriate mitigation and elimination strategies. You can see a little more here. That is hard, fixing wrong practices and the causes of wrong practices. But on the scale of hard thing for agile coaches, it's probably not the hardest. For me, that is the variability of good practices, which, looking at the clock, is going to have to be the next video. I hope this has been useful, I hope it's been fun, and I hope to see you at the next video. Take care and goodbye. Ooh, one last thing. If you want a bit of entertainment and maybe some value before the next article, why don't you run the Nigel Scale over something big and chunky and possibly very smelly, like safe or maybe even gin. Have a good time. Take care.